Sometimes the best way to win is to stay silent. In this Savage Endings compilation, no shouting, no begging, just calm exposure and brutal clarity. The louder they lied, the faster they fell apart. This is I didn't say a word and they exposed themselves.
He tried to flirt with someone else to shame me. I let his games end his career. It happened at a company event I almost didn't attend. One of those tedious, after-hours mixers designed to make people feel connected while pretending none of us were thinking about deadlines or performance reviews. I had been standing near the back of the rooftop bar, sipping a watered-down cocktail, watching the city lights blur into one another, when I caught sight of him. Marcus, my fiancé, laughing too loudly at something a junior analyst had said, leaning in too close, placing a hand on her arm in a way that made my stomach knot immediately. It wasn't casual. It wasn't innocent. It was deliberate. The girl, Kara, looked flustered but flattered, glancing around to see who might be watching. And Marcus, well, he made sure I was. He didn't see me at first, tucked away near the edge of the crowd. But when he finally did, he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he smiled at me, a slow, smug curl of his lips, as if daring me to react. It wasn't the flirtation that broke something inside me that night. It was the way he wanted me to see it. The way he wanted to humiliate me, as if diminishing me in front of others somehow made him more powerful. I set my glass down carefully on a nearby table, the condensation leaving a small, trembling circle behind. I didn't make a scene, didn't storm across the room, didn't slap the drink out of his hand like something out of a bad movie. I simply stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me. This wasn't about Kara. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about respect, or the absence of it. And standing there in my carefully chosen dress, in heels that pinched just slightly after a long day, I realized something far more important than anything he could take from me that night. He had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. And I wasn't going to argue with him about it. I was going to let him bury himself, one reckless move at a time. It's strange how quickly something you thought was solid can begin to feel hollow. I went through the motions the rest of that night, smiling politely, thanking our hosts, pretending I didn't feel every glance in the room like a tiny blade against my skin. Marcus didn't come looking for me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't even bother offering some clumsy excuse for what he knew I had seen. He simply enjoyed himself, like nothing had happened. That was the moment I realized the wound he had opened wasn't new. It was old and deep, covered over with layers of excuses, overlooked slights, tiny betrayals I had taught myself not to name because they weren't big enough to justify leaving. The times he rolled his eyes when I spoke during meetings, the way he minimized my successes in front of friends, turning accomplishments into punchlines, the subtle corrections when I told stories, not wrong enough to be malicious, but just enough to shift the light away from me and onto him. For a long time, I told myself it was harmless, that he didn't mean it, that he loved me, and love could be careless sometimes without meaning to hurt. But standing there, watching him flirt openly, smirking when he caught me watching, I understood something I hadn't wanted to before. It wasn't carelessness. It was a choice. 100 small choices that added up to one simple truth. He didn't respect me. And without respect, love was just another story people told themselves to justify staying. I left the event early, making some polite excuse about an early morning meeting. Marcus didn't offer to come with me. He barely noticed I was gone. I rode the elevator down alone, the city lights blurring behind the glass, and promised myself one thing. I would not fight to stay where I was not valued. I would not beg a man to treat me like I mattered. I would not mistake proximity for partnership ever again. Once you stop explaining things away, you start seeing them for what they really are. The next morning I woke up early, long before my alarm, with a quiet unease humming beneath my skin. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, stared at the engagement ring still perched neatly on my finger, and for the first time, I really thought about all the small things I had forgiven without even realizing I was forgiving them. The meetings where Marcus forgot to introduce me properly. The dinners where he joked about how emotional I could be when things didn't go my way. The parties where he spent more time networking with strangers than checking if I had even made it through the door. Individually, they were easy to dismiss. Tiny oversights, missteps smoothed over by charm and apologies when needed. But together, they formed a pattern too clear to ignore. Marcus didn't see me as an equal. He saw me as an accessory, a box checked, a symbol of stability he could point to when it suited him, and discard when it didn't. I thought about the way he used to praise me in private, telling me how proud he was, how impressive it was that I could hold my own in a room full of executives. At the time, it had felt like a compliment. Now it sounded like a warning. Remember your place. Don't shine too brightly. Don't make me feel small. It wasn't just about the flirting. It wasn't even about Kara. It was about the quiet erosion of respect that had been happening for years. While I convinced myself that love was enough to survive it, it wasn't. Respect was the foundation, and without it, everything we had built was already crumbling. Long before that night on the rooftop made it impossible to pretend otherwise. I set my coffee down and slid the ring from my finger, just for a moment, just to feel the weight lift. It was lighter than I expected, almost as if it had been waiting for me to notice all along. If Marcus noticed the difference in me, he didn't say anything. Maybe he thought I had gotten over it. Maybe he assumed that one more minor embarrassment would fade like the others, buried under the weight of shared history and future promises. And for a while, I let him believe that. I still went to the dinners, still showed up at the office parties, still wore the ring he had given me with such grand ceremony. I still smiled, still laughed at the appropriate moments, still played the part he needed me to play. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. The connection I had spent years nurturing, the one built on trust and shared ambition, had been quietly severed. Now everything felt like performance. When he kissed me goodbye in the mornings, I kissed him back, thinking only of the day I would no longer have to pretend. When he called me his better half in front of colleagues, I smiled politely, wondering if he even understood the irony. He didn't realize it, but every moment he dismissed, every time he treated me like a prop in his professional theater, he was giving me exactly what I needed: distance, clarity, resolve. I didn't confront him, didn't accuse, didn't shout or cry or plead. Instead, I collected small observations, quiet truths. I watched him flirt more boldly when he thought my attention was elsewhere. Watched him dismiss my contributions in meetings as if they were afterthoughts. Watched him become the architect of his own downfall, one careless action at a time. It wasn't vengeance that kept me patient. It wasn't anger either. It was the understanding that real consequences don't need to be forced. Given enough time, people reveal exactly who they are. And Marcus was revealing himself more clearly with every passing day. All I had to do was keep smiling, keep moving, and wait for the moment when he would be the one standing on the edge of everything he thought he controlled, and realize he was already falling. The more I pulled back, the bolder Marcus became. It was almost like he could sense the shift between us, but instead of trying to fix it, he doubled down on the performance. At work events, he flirted more openly. Little things at first, an unnecessary compliment here, a lingering touch there, always within the bounds of what could be brushed off as harmless. Always just subtle enough to give him plausible deniability if anyone dared to question it. But he wasn't subtle with me. When he caught my eye across a crowded room, his smile was different now. Sharper, more deliberate. He wanted me to see him. He wanted me to react. It wasn't enough for him to disrespect me quietly anymore. He needed an audience. He needed witnesses to my supposed failure to keep his attention. It was a dangerous game he was playing, one he was far too arrogant to recognize the risks of. In his mind, he was untouchable, beloved by leadership, protected by the same network of connections he had spent years carefully cultivating. He thought he could humiliate me without consequence, believing that I would swallow my pride to keep the peace, to protect our shared future. But what Marcus didn't understand, what he had never bothered to learn, was that my loyalty was never blind. I had stayed because I believed in what we were building together. The moment that belief died, so did any obligation I felt to protect him. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply finished. And while Marcus played at being the charming golden boy, securing promotions and accolades with a wink and a smile, I was quietly gathering everything I needed, because there's a difference between people who build their success on skill and those who build it on appearances. One can survive scrutiny. The other? It crumbles the moment someone stops pretending not to see. And I had stopped pretending. Completely. It's amazing how much people reveal when they think you're no longer paying attention. While Marcus basked in the easy attention of coworkers and clients, I started paying closer attention to the details he overlooked. Conversations left half-finished. Inside jokes that didn't include me. Mentions of dinners, happy hours, and after-hours meetings that I was never invited to, but that somehow included the same small group of women he seemed to linger near a little too often. I didn't rush. I didn't confront. Instead, I took notes. Not literal ones. Nothing that could make me seem vindictive or emotional if it came to a battle of perceptions. Just quiet mental snapshots of who was where, what was said, how often the stories shifted when different people were involved. I noticed patterns. Certain coworkers who always seemed to leave events around the same time Marcus did. Receipts tucked into his pockets for restaurants he swore he hated. There were text messages, too. Accidental flashes on his phone when he left it face up on the kitchen counter. Nothing explicitly damning on their own, but when strung together, they formed a narrative that even he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of. I also started observing how he handled professional boundaries. Or rather, how he didn't. Comments made in jest during meetings that lingered just a little too long on the wrong side of appropriate. Playful nudges at conferences that could be explained away as harmless, until you saw the discomfort flicker across someone's face for just a moment before it disappeared. Marcus had built his career on charm and momentum, trusting that no one would look too closely at the cracks. But charm doesn't protect you forever. Eventually, someone starts asking the right questions. Eventually, someone stops laughing. And when that time came, I wouldn't have to scream or accuse. I would simply lay down the truth he had given me, piece by reckless piece. He was already writing his downfall. All I had to do was let him finish. I thought I was alone at first. That if I spoke up, no one would believe me. That Marcus's charm would shield him the way it always had. But the longer I watched, the more I realized how many others were watching too. It started quietly. A side comment from a colleague after a department meeting. A raised eyebrow when Marcus lingered too long at someone's desk. Little signals. Fleeting moments of recognition. At first, I brushed them off, unsure if they were real or just the product of my own heightened awareness. But one afternoon, after a particularly uncomfortable client lunch, a woman from another department caught up with me in the hallway. She didn't mention Marcus by name. She didn't have to. She simply said, "If you ever need someone to back you up, someone who's seen things, you're not alone." Then she squeezed my arm lightly and disappeared into a conference room. It was the smallest gesture, but it cracked something open inside me that I hadn't realized was still holding on. Hope. I wasn't imagining it, and I wasn't the only one tired of pretending not to see. Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated. A quiet conversation by the coffee machine. An offhand remark during happy hour. A text from a colleague who had noticed how Marcus's attention shifted depending on who could be useful to him that day. No one said anything publicly. Not yet, but the foundation was there. People who had spent years keeping their heads down were starting to look up, starting to realize they weren't alone in what they had witnessed. It wasn't just about Marcus flirting anymore. It was about the environment he had helped create. One where people felt uncomfortable speaking out, where appearances mattered more than respect. The truth had been growing in the shadows for a long time. All it needed was a little light, and when the time came, it wouldn't just be my voice. It would be a chorus, one he wouldn't be able to talk over. There's a moment in every story when the outcome stops being negotiable. A moment when the path is already set, even if the people walking it haven't realized yet. For me, that moment came on an ordinary Wednesday. We were attending a leadership conference, the kind of event Marcus loved, full of handshakes and surface-level charm, another stage for him to perform. The first night, there was a cocktail reception in the hotel ballroom. Low lighting, a live band, the soft clink of champagne glasses. I watched from across the room as Marcus leaned in too close to a junior associate, laughing a little too loudly at something she said, his hand resting just a little too long on her back as he guided her toward the bar. And for the first time, I didn't feel the usual punch of humiliation. I didn't feel sadness or anger or even betrayal. I felt certainty. He wasn't going to change. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to. Marcus liked the attention, liked the power, and he believed with every entitled bone in his body that he was too valuable to ever be held accountable for how he used it. That was his fatal mistake. He thought he was invincible. He thought no one would ever dare challenge him. He thought I would stay quiet. But what he didn't know was that silence can be louder than rage. I stayed until the speeches ended, until the band packed up, until Marcus was comfortably buzzed and self-satisfied, oblivious to the conversations happening in the corners of the room. Then I slipped away, quietly, unnoticed. I went back to my hotel room, sat at the desk, and began writing everything down. Every detail, every date, every pattern I had observed. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about choosing myself over the slow, soul-crushing erosion of pretending things were fine. And once that decision was made, there was no going back. The rest was just a matter of time. After that night, everything about the way I moved through the world changed. Not visibly. Not in a way Marcus would immediately notice. To him, everything looked the same. We still showed up to the same meetings. Still exchanged polite smiles in front of the right people. Still kept up the appearance of a perfect partnership. But underneath the surface, I was pulling away from him one thread at a time. At work, I started stepping into opportunities he had always subtly steered me away from. The projects he said were too much or too political for someone like me to take on. I accepted them without asking his opinion. I stayed later at the office, but not with him. Not orbiting his world. Building my own instead. I updated my professional portfolio, quietly reaching out to contacts I had allowed to go cold while focusing too much on his career path, and not enough on my own. I met with mentors. I sat in on panels. I attended networking events solo, making connections that had nothing to do with Marcus's circle. The more distance I created, the easier it became to see how much space he had taken up in my life. Space I could have been filling with my own ambitions, my own voice. At home, the shifts were even smaller, but somehow heavier. I stopped initiating conversations about the future. I let the wedding plans sit untouched in folders on the desk. Ignored the calendar reminders that used to send a flutter of excitement through me. When Marcus asked about venues or guest lists, I nodded noncommittally, giving him just enough to keep him comfortable, while quietly untangling myself from a future that no longer felt like mine. He didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed just enough to convince himself it wasn't worth looking too closely. Either way, it didn't matter. Because by the time he realized how far away I had moved, it would be too late. I wasn't just leaving him. I was leaving the version of myself who thought loyalty required silence. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A regional leadership summit was scheduled. A multi-day event bringing together senior executives, department heads, and key staff from every corner of the company. It was the kind of event Marcus lived for. A stage large enough to shine on, enough important eyes to make every move feel significant. He spent weeks preparing for it, polishing his presentations, lining up side meetings, planning how to position himself for the next promotion that everyone knew was coming. I stayed in the background, offering encouragement when necessary, nodding at the right moments. All the while, I was preparing too, just not for the same outcome he was chasing. I wasn't interested in confrontation. I didn't want to ruin his night with some messy, emotional outburst. That wasn't the point. The point was to let the truth speak for itself. The HR department had an anonymous reporting channel, one the company had encouraged employees to use if they ever felt uncomfortable, but that most people didn't trust enough to actually use. I wasn't most people. I had the documentation, the screenshots, the list of witnesses willing to quietly confirm what they had seen if pressed. I spent one evening putting it all together. A clear, factual account of Marcus's repeated boundary-crossing behavior, professional misconduct, inappropriate communications, abusive influence over junior employees. No accusations without evidence. No emotional embellishments. Just facts laid out carefully, exactly the way HR departments couldn't ignore. I submitted it quietly, anonymously, days before the summit. And then I waited, not with anger, not with anxiety, with a calm certainty that the truth, once set loose, would find its mark. Marcus was walking into a room full of people he believed were there to celebrate him. What he didn't realize was that some of them were already asking questions. And soon he would have to answer them. Not because I forced it, because he had. And when the foundation finally cracked, I wouldn't need to lift a finger to push it down. Gravity would do the work for me. The first cracks didn't come with shouting. They came with silence. Small shifts in the way people greeted him at the summit. Averted eyes. Shorter conversations. Smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. At first, Marcus didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the attention he thought he was still commanding, circulating through the crowd like a man assured of his place at the top. But by the second day, the tone had changed. Executives he had been desperate to impress were suddenly too busy for private meetings. Clients who once sought him out now redirected their conversations elsewhere. I stayed on the periphery, watching it unfold, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, settled sense of inevitability. Marcus didn't understand what was happening. Not yet. He still tried to make jokes, tried to charm his way through the growing chill around him. But charm only works when people want to believe you deserve it. And once doubt creeps in, once the sheen of invincibility wears off, there's no easy way to put it back. Midway through the afternoon, he was pulled aside by two senior HR managers. Calm, professional, unreadable. The conversation didn't happen in a closed office. It happened at the edge of the lobby, visible enough for anyone paying attention to know that it was serious. He tried to laugh it off at first, gesturing animatedly, as if he could still spin the situation back into something harmless. But the faces of the people listening didn't change. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a professional gathering when someone powerful falls out of favor. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's clinical, efficient. And when Marcus returned to the main room, his shoulders slightly hunched, his smile brittle and forced, the crowd closed around him differently. Not as a safety net, as witnesses. He glanced around the room, searching for the familiar anchors he had once relied on. But they were gone. And for the first time since the night on the rooftop, he looked small, deflated, and very, very alone. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes when you realize you don't have to do anything at all. Marcus was unraveling in real time, and all I had to do was watch. I didn't gloat. I didn't whisper in corners or exchange smug looks with the people who had once pretended not to notice him. I simply moved through the summit like I belonged there. Because I did. While Marcus scrambled to hold on to conversations that grew colder with every passing hour. I sat in panels, took notes, asked questions. I introduced myself to people I had once only met through him. People who now seemed eager to shake my hand directly, as if realizing too late that I had always been worth knowing in my own right. By the second evening, the murmurs had spread beyond our internal circles. Vendors, partners, clients. The questions weren't whispered anymore. They were asked plainly. What's going on with Marcus? Is it true? How long has this been happening? The beauty of it was that I didn't have to answer. The truth had already started speaking for itself, threading its way through the network he had spent years curating, unraveling his reputation stitch by careful stitch. By the time the summit wrapped, the executives who had once sung his praises were exchanging looks of concern instead of admiration. He was called into meetings he didn't schedule, asked questions he couldn't deflect with charm or vague promises. And through it all, I stayed steady, present, professional, unbothered, because none of it required me anymore. Marcus had handed everyone the rope himself. All I had done was let him tie the knots, watching him lose the thing he valued most. Not me, but his status. Wasn't the revenge I once thought I needed. It was something far better. It was proof that respect, real, earned respect, can't be faked. And once it's gone, there's no easy way to get it back. When the summit ended, there was no dramatic goodbye. No tearful confrontation in a hotel lobby. No desperate pleas for forgiveness. Just two people packing their bags in separate corners of the same room, surrounded by a silence too heavy to ignore. Marcus didn't ask me how I was feeling. He didn't offer explanations for the whispers that now followed him down every hallway. He didn't even ask if I believed them. He knew better. The drive home was quiet. He kept glancing over at me, like he wanted to say something, but every time he opened his mouth, nothing came out. It didn't matter. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my mind was already made up. There would be no fight. No messy post-mortem where we sifted through the ashes for something salvageable. Some things are meant to end. And this had ended long before either of us was willing to admit it. While Marcus busied himself unpacking and pretending the walls weren't closing in, I packed a different kind of bag. Not a dramatic flurry of clothes thrown into a suitcase. No angry slamming of drawers. Just quiet, methodical movement. The essentials. The things that belonged only to me. The life I had built for myself before I ever let him think he could own a piece of it. When I left, I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe him an explanation he was never going to hear. I simply locked the door behind me. Gets in my hunt. A future he would never touch waiting just beyond the curb. There's a certain kind of power in leaving with nothing but your own dignity intact. No screaming. No broken promises scattered in your wake. Just the simple, steady sound of your own footsteps. Walking away from everything that tried to make you forget your worth. And as I turned the corner, the house disappearing behind me, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I was running away, but because I was finally, walking toward something real. Starting over wasn't as dramatic as I thought it would be. It was quieter, simpler. A series of small choices made with intention instead of fear. I found a tiny apartment on the other side of the city. Nothing glamorous. but every inch of it mine. The walls were bare. The furniture was secondhand, but it was peaceful in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. There were no careful negotiations about whose schedule mattered more. No small sacrifices disguised as compromises. No games designed to make me doubt my place in the room. Just space. Space to think, to heal, to build a life that didn't require shrinking myself to make someone else comfortable. I threw myself into my work, not as a distraction, but as a reclamation. The professional network I had quietly rebuilt while Marcus wasn't looking open doors he would never have held open for me. Opportunities that didn't hinge on his reputation. Success that wasn't tied to his approval. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't second-guessing myself. I didn't wonder if I was too ambitious, too assertive, too much. I was exactly who I needed to be, and the people who mattered saw it without me having to apologize for it. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from, people who reminded me who I was before I started measuring my worth through someone else's gaze. We laughed louder, dreamed bigger, and somewhere along the way, the hurt stopped feeling like an open wound and started feeling like scar tissue. Stronger, tougher, a reminder of how much I had survived. I didn't need Marcus's approval. I didn't need anyone's permission to exist fully. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't mourning. I was living. Not perfectly, not without fear, but fully. And that, more than anything else, was the life he could never have given me. Because it wasn't his to give. It had always been mine. I didn't hear much about Marcus after I left. A few whispers made their way to me through old colleagues. Rumors about a formal investigation. A few key clients quietly distancing themselves. There was no dramatic collapse. No headlines. No spectacular fall from grace. Just a slow, steady erosion of the image he had worked so hard to maintain. And I wasn't there to watch it happen. I didn't need to be. I was too busy building something he would never be able to touch. The new job I accepted came with a title Marcus once told me I wasn't ready for. It came with a team that valued collaboration over competition. It came with the kind of respect that doesn't have to be demanded or earned through silence. It just existed, because people understood the worth of the ones standing beside them. I moved through that world differently. Not cautiously, not apologetically. I said what I thought, took up the space I deserved, trusted my instincts instead of second-guessing every move. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about living the life I had been too scared to claim before. There were days when doubt crept in, moments when I questioned if walking away had been the right thing, if starting over had been worth the risk. But those moments passed quickly now, because every promotion, every project completed with integrity, every night I came home to a space that was fully mine, was a reminder. I hadn't just survived losing him. I had survived losing the version of myself who thought I needed someone like him to feel complete. And standing in the life I built with my own two hands, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and respected me fully, I knew the truth without question. There are some things a man like Marcus can never take from you. He can try to shame you. He can try to diminish you. But he can never touch a future you've already claimed for yourself. For a long time, I thought winning meant proving him wrong. That one day he would look at me, at everything I had become without him, and realize exactly what he had lost. And maybe he did. Maybe he sat alone in some dim office, scrolling through the curated highlights of a life he no longer had access to. But somewhere along the way, I stopped caring. The real victory wasn't about him. It wasn't about his regret, or his downfall, or even the way the truth finally caught up to him. It was about the quiet moments no one else saw. The mornings when I woke up with a sense of peace instead of dread. The meetings where I spoke freely without weighing every word for how it might bruise someone else's ego. The friendships that deepened because they were rooted in honesty instead of obligation. It was in the way I learned to trust my instincts again. The way I stopped apologizing for taking up space. The way I built a life that didn't require me to shrink to fit inside someone else's version of success. Marcus didn't destroy me. He didn't even break me. He simply revealed a fault line that had been there all along. A fracture I had been too willing to ignore for the sake of keeping the peace. And when it finally split open, I didn't fall apart. I stepped over the rubble, kept moving, and built something stronger on the other side. The real victory wasn't a single moment. It wasn't captured in an audience or a dramatic reveal. It was the quiet, steady decision to choose myself. Every day, in every room, without asking for permission. It was the life that unfolded after the end, bright and real and wholly mine. A life not defined by what I lost, but by everything I had the courage to rebuild. And in that life, he was nothing more than a footnote, a lesson, a door I chose to close, so I could finally walk through the one that had been waiting for me all along.
Her brother tried to intimidate me, I used his secrets against him. The first time I realized I was in trouble, really in trouble, was the night Caleb cornered me at his sister's engagement party. It was a warm Saturday in July, the kind of humid, sticky evening that clings to your skin, makes your shirt stick to your back, leaves a faint sheen of sweat on your forehead. The kind of night when the city hums with a slow, lazy energy, when the air is thick with the smell of grilling meat and fresh-cut grass, when the distant, muffled thump of a passing car's bass line echoes off the brick walls of downtown apartments. I was standing by the bar, nursing my second whiskey, my tie already loosened, the top button of my shirt undone, my shoulders aching from hours of small talk and polite, forced laughter. I had just set my glass down, the cool condensation slipping between my fingers, when I felt a heavy hand clap down on my shoulder, the thick, blunt weight of someone who didn't care about personal space, someone who wanted me to know exactly who was in control. I turned, my pulse already spiking, my mind racing through the possible faces, the potential threats, the small, nagging fears that had been simmering at the back of my mind for weeks. It was Caleb. Mia's older brother. The one with the hard jaw and the sharp eyes, the one who had never quite warmed to me, the one who had always looked at me like I was an intruder, an unwanted guest at a family gathering. "Walk with me," he said, his voice low, his grip tightening on my shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he nodded toward the balcony doors, the thin, white curtains fluttering in the warm, night breeze. I hesitated, my mind already turning over the possible reasons for his sudden interest, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to read the tight set of his jaw, the small, dark flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. But I followed him, because what choice did I have? I had promised Mia that I would make an effort, that I would try to bridge the gap between myself and her brother, that I would prove to him that I was worthy of her, that I wasn't the villain he had convinced himself I was. The balcony doors swung shut behind us, the soft, muffled thump of music and laughter slipping away as we stepped into the warm, sticky darkness, the distant hum of the city stretching out before us like 1,000 whispered secrets. And as Caleb turned to face me, his jaw tight, his eyes cold, his fists clenching at his sides, I felt the first, sharp sting of fear creep into my chest, the slow, creeping certainty that whatever happened next would change everything. Caleb didn't waste time. The moment the balcony door swung shut behind us, he turned, his broad shoulders blocking out the light spilling through the glass, his shadow stretching long across the weathered planks beneath our feet. I felt the tight grip of his hand leave my shoulder, the ghost of his touch still burning against my skin, my mind racing, my pulse thundering in my ears as I tried to anticipate his next move. He took a step closer, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths, each inhale a small, silent reminder of the control he held in this moment. "Listen," he said, his voice low, his tone steady, the quiet, deliberate calm of a man who had already made up his mind. "I'm only going to say this once, so I suggest you pay attention." I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides, my nails biting into my palms, the cool, damp air clinging to my skin as I forced myself to meet his gaze, to hold my ground, to refuse to flinch beneath the weight of his scrutiny. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing, the sharp, dark flicker of something dangerous slipping into his expression as his lips curled into a small, humorless smile. "I don't trust you," he said, each word clipped, precise, delivered with the kind of quiet, unshakable certainty that felt like a punch to the gut. "I never have. And I never will." I felt the first stirrings of anger bloom in my chest, the slow, simmering pulse of frustration that came from being judged, from being weighed and found wanting, from being reduced to a caricature of a man, to a list of flaws and shortcomings that Caleb had convinced himself were all I had to offer. "I don't care what Mia sees in you," he continued, his voice dropping lower, the words slipping from his lips like a slow, steady drip of poison, each syllable laced with the sharp, bitter sting of contempt. "But I'm telling you right now, if you ever hurt her, if you ever lie to her, if you ever make her question her worth, I will make you regret it." I felt my jaw clench, my teeth grinding together as his words settled into the space between us, as the full weight of his threat crashed down around me like a wave, cold and sharp and impossible to ignore. "I will find you," he said, his eyes locking with mine, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, "and I will make sure you never forget the mistake you made." And as he straightened, as he took a small, deliberate step back, as he turned to leave without another word, I felt the slow, creeping burn of anger twist into something colder, something sharper, something that felt a lot like resolve. He had threatened me. Made me feel small. Made me feel weak. Made me feel like a man with something to hide. But what Caleb didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that I had my own secrets. My own leverage. My own truths to threaten. And when the time came, I would make sure he understood exactly who he was dealing with. The tension from that night lingered, settling into the corners of my mind like a dull ache, a small, nagging pulse of resentment that refused to fade. I found myself watching Caleb more closely after that, my eyes tracking his movements at family gatherings, my ears straining to catch the low rumble of his voice in crowded rooms, my mind turning over his words, trying to unravel the truth behind his threat. It wasn't just the tone he had used, the tight, clipped delivery of a man who had already made up his mind. It was the way he had looked at me, the quiet, unspoken certainty in his eyes, the small, dark flicker of something dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. For a while, I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was letting my own insecurities twist his words into something they weren't. That he was just being protective, that he was just looking out for his sister, that he had every right to be wary of the man dating his only sibling. But then I started to notice the small, subtle cracks in Caleb's carefully constructed image, the tiny, almost imperceptible slips in his polished facade, the small, telling moments that felt like whispered secrets slipping through the cracks in his carefully curated life. Like the way his jaw would clench when someone mentioned Mia's success at work, the small, almost imperceptible tightening of his grip on his drink, the sharp, dark flicker of jealousy that passed across his features before he forced his smile back into place. Or the way he would change the subject when the conversation turned to his own career, the small, nervous flick of his eyes, the tight, forced laugh he used to cover the discomfort that rippled through his body at the mention of his stalled startup, the business he had poured his heart into, the dream that had slowly, steadily crumbled beneath the weight of his own expectations. Or the way he would glare at his wife, Sophie, when she spoke too freely, when her laughter grew a little too loud, when her smile stretched a little too wide, the small, sharp flicker of resentment in his eyes when she made a joke at his expense, the tight, uncomfortable silence that would settle over the table whenever she caught his eye. And slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. The whispered warnings from mutual friends, the small, subtle glances that passed between Caleb and his closest allies, the quiet, unspoken tension that hung in the air whenever his name came up in conversation. Caleb wasn't just a protective older brother. He was a man with something to hide. A man with his own secrets. A man who had built his life on a foundation of lies, and who was terrified of the day those lies would come crashing down around him. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the weeks stretched into months, I felt the first small flicker of power bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. I had my own leverage now. My own truths to threaten. And when the time came, I would make sure Caleb understood exactly who he was dealing with. It wasn't long before the cracks in Caleb's carefully constructed facade began to widen. At first, it was just small things, little details that would have slipped past me if I hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't already decided to keep a closer eye on him, if I hadn't already started to question the man behind the polished smile and the firm handshake. Like the way he would go quiet when his wife, Sophie, entered the room, his shoulders tightening, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she leaned in to kiss his cheek, her perfume lingering in the air like a whispered secret. Or the way he seemed to avoid his own home, the way his car was often missing from the driveway long after he should have been home from work, the way his phone buzzed late into the night, the faint, insistent vibration slipping through the thin walls of their shared apartment, the small, subtle sound of a man with something to hide. And then there were the whispers, the quiet, half-heard fragments of conversations that slipped through the cracks in the crowded rooms of family gatherings, the small, subtle glances that passed between his friends, the tight, uncomfortable silences that settled over the table whenever someone mentioned his business, his finances, his marriage. I started digging. Not in a dramatic, movie-style way. Not with late-night stakeouts or hacked passwords or whispered phone calls in the dark. Just small, quiet acts of observation, small, deliberate steps that felt like whispered secrets slipping through the cracks in Caleb's carefully curated life. I watched the way he moved through the world, the way he glanced over his shoulder when he thought no one was watching, the way his smile slipped when his phone buzzed during dinner, the way his jaw tightened when Sophie laughed a little too loudly at a joke that hit a little too close to home. I started paying attention to his patterns, his habits, the small, subtle ways he tried to control the world around him, the small, telling moments that felt like cracks in the foundation of the life he had built on a foundation of lies. And slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. He was hiding something. Something big. Something that had the potential to shatter the carefully constructed image he had built for himself, to destroy the life he had spent years crafting from the shards of broken promises and whispered lies. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, subtle hints of his deception began to add up, I felt the first flicker of power bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. Caleb had threatened me. Had tried to make me feel small. Had tried to make me feel weak. Had tried to paint me as the villain in his sister's story. But what Caleb didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that I had my own secrets. My own leverage. My own truths to threaten. And when the time came, I would make sure he understood exactly who he was dealing with. It was Sophie who gave me my first real break. It happened at a family barbecue, the kind of loud, chaotic gathering that Mia loved, the kind of day that felt like a reminder of why I had fallen in love with her in the first place, the warmth of her laughter, the brightness of her smile, the easy, unguarded way she moved through the world when surrounded by the people she loved. We had just finished dinner, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the backyard, the air thick with the smell of grilled meat and freshly cut grass, the distant, echoing thump of children's laughter carrying on the breeze. I had been leaning against the railing of the back deck, my fingers curled loosely around a cold beer, my eyes tracking Mia as she moved through the crowd, her head tipped back in laughter, her dark hair catching the last, warm rays of sunlight, her dress swaying softly against her legs as she leaned into the small, tight-knit group of women gathered near the fire pit. That's when Sophie joined me. She slipped into the empty space beside me, her shoulder brushing against mine, her perfume wrapping around me like a soft, cloying fog, her glass of wine catching the last, dying light of the sun. She took a slow, deliberate sip, her eyes flicking to the side, her lips curling into a small, tight smile as she leaned in, her voice low, her breath warm against my ear. "They make a beautiful couple, don't they?" she said, her tone light, her words slipping from her lips like a small, quiet confession, her eyes locking with mine for just a moment before she looked away, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. I hesitated, my mind racing, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to read the tight set of her jaw, the small, dark flicker of something dangerous in her eyes. "Who?" I asked, my voice a little too casual, a little too light, my mind already turning over the possible meanings behind her words, the small, whispered hints of something darker lurking just beneath the surface. She turned, her eyes locking with mine, her smile slipping, her lips parting in a small, quiet breath as she realized her mistake, as she realized the words she had let slip, as she realized the truth she had just revealed without meaning to. "Nothing," she said quickly, her voice sharp, her eyes narrowing as she straightened, as she pulled back, as she took a small, deliberate step away from me, her fingers curling into tight fists at her sides. "I didn't mean. I wasn't. I just meant." But it was too late. The damage had been done. The small, subtle crack in her polished facade had already formed, and I felt the first real flicker of power bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. Sophie had slipped. And now, all I had to do was follow the thread she had so carelessly dropped, to pull on the loose end she had left dangling in the warm, golden light of a summer evening, to unravel the carefully constructed lie she had tried so desperately to hide. Sophie's slip stayed with me. I replayed the moment in my mind a dozen times, the way her eyes had widened, the way her fingers had tightened around the stem of her glass, the way her breath had caught in her throat as she realized what she had said, the small, whispered confession that had slipped from her lips like a half-forgotten secret. "They make a beautiful couple, don't they?" I couldn't let it go. The words echoed in my mind, tangled around my thoughts, wrapped themselves around my better judgment like a slowly tightening noose. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was letting my own insecurities twist her words into something they weren't, that I was being paranoid, that I was seeing shadows where there were none. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Sophie had meant something by that comment. Something specific. Something deliberate. Something that had slipped past her carefully guarded defenses in a moment of unguarded honesty, something that had felt too big, too real, too dangerous to ignore. I started watching her more closely after that. Not in a creepy, stalker way, but in the quiet, deliberate way of a man who has already decided to unravel a mystery, who has already committed himself to pulling on the loose threads of a carefully woven lie. I paid attention to the way she moved through the world. The way her eyes flicked to her phone a little too often. The way her fingers tightened around her wine glass when Caleb entered the room. The way her laugh grew a little too loud when he made a joke at her expense. The small, subtle way she seemed to brace herself whenever he drew near. I started listening, too. To the small, whispered conversations that slipped through the cracks in crowded rooms. To the quiet, half-heard fragments of phone calls that drifted through the thin walls of family gatherings. To the small, subtle shifts in her voice when she spoke to her friends. The tight, clipped tone of a woman with something to hide. And slowly, the pieces began to come together. There were late nights when her car wasn't in the driveway. Quiet phone calls in the middle of the night. Her voice low. Her words sharp. The small, nervous glances she threw over her shoulder when she thought no one was watching. And then there were the glances. The small, stolen moments of eye contact that passed between her and a tall, dark-haired man at a friend's birthday party. The small, sharp flickers of something dangerous in their eyes. The small, unspoken promises that felt like whispered secrets slipping through the cracks in the carefully constructed life she had built with Caleb. I felt my pulse quicken. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as the pieces of the puzzle slowly, steadily fell into place. Each small, whispered secret slipping through the cracks in Sophie's carefully curated life. Each small, whispered hint of betrayal pushing me closer to the truth I had been too afraid to face. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the weeks stretched into months, I felt the first real flicker of power bloom in my chest. The slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. I had found the thread. And now, all I had to do was pull. It took a while, longer than I expected, but I finally found my first real piece of proof. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the kind of slow, lazy day that slips past without notice, when the world feels too warm, too heavy, too still. I had been sitting at my desk, my laptop open in front of me, the soft, steady hum of my office's air conditioning droning in my ears, my fingers tapping out a slow, aimless rhythm against the cool, polished surface of my desk. I hadn't meant to stumble onto the truth that day, hadn't set out to uncover the first crack in Sophie's carefully constructed facade, hadn't planned to unravel the first thread in the web of lies she had so carefully woven around herself and Caleb. But then I opened my inbox, scrolled through the flood of unread messages, the endless chain of client emails and project updates and calendar reminders, my eyes flicking over the familiar names and subject lines, my mind already drifting to the list of tasks waiting for me at the end of the day. And then I saw it. A name I hadn't expected. A name that sent a sharp, electric jolt of recognition through my mind, a small, whispered warning that felt like a cold, sharp blade slipping between my ribs. It was a message from James Harper, Caleb's business partner, the tall, dark-haired man I had seen Sophie talking to at that birthday party, the same man whose eyes had lingered a little too long on her bare shoulders, whose hand had brushed a little too lightly against the small of her back, whose smile had stretched a little too wide when she leaned in to whisper something in his ear. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the trackpad, my mind racing, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to decide what to do, what this meant, what the small, whispered fragment of a connection might reveal. I clicked on the message, my breath catching in my throat as the screen flickered, the small, black text slipping into focus, the first real hint of the truth I had been too afraid to face. It was a simple email, just a few short sentences, a quick, casual update on a business deal, a small, unremarkable note slipped into the endless stream of correspondence between business partners. But at the bottom, tucked into the corner of the screen like a small, whispered secret, was the message history, the long, winding thread of emails that had passed between James and Sophie, the small, quiet reminders of meetings, the shared, breathless laughter captured in the careless, half-typed fragments of late-night messages, the small, telling moments that felt like whispered confessions slipping through the cracks in their carefully curated lives. And as I scrolled through the messages, my eyes flicking over the small, stolen promises, the quiet, breathless confessions, the soft, whispered words of a woman who had long since forgotten the man she had once promised to love, I felt the first real flicker of power bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. I had found my proof. And now, all I had to do was decide what to do with it. I waited for the right moment to confront Sophie, to pull on the loose thread I had found, to unravel the carefully constructed lie she had wrapped around herself and Caleb, to expose the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. It came on a Friday evening, at another one of those carefully curated family gatherings, the kind where the wine flows a little too freely, the laughter rings a little too loudly, the polite, forced smiles stretch a little too tight. I found her alone on the back deck, leaning against the railing, her glass of red wine catching the last, dying light of the setting sun, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her shoulders tense, her posture stiff, the small, sharp flicker of something dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. I stepped out onto the deck, the cool evening air slipping around me like a whispered secret, the distant, muffled hum of conversation slipping through the open door behind me, the soft, steady thump of music drifting through the thin walls of the house. "Sophie," I said, my voice low, my tone steady, the quiet, deliberate calm of a man who has already made up his mind, who has already committed himself to the confrontation he has been building toward for weeks. She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, her eyes flicking to the side, the small, subtle shift of a woman who has been caught, who has been cornered, who has been found out. She didn't turn to face me, didn't meet my eyes, didn't offer the small, tight smile she had once used to disarm me, to lull me into a false sense of security, to convince me that she was nothing more than the polished, perfect wife Caleb had convinced himself she was. "I know about James," I said, my voice low, my words slipping from my lips like a small, whispered confession, the slow, steady drip of truth that felt like a blade slipping between her ribs. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her fingers tightening around the glass in her hand, the thin, delicate stem creaking beneath the pressure of her grip, the dark, red liquid sloshing against the sides of the glass like a silent, whispered warning. "I've seen the emails," I continued, taking a small, deliberate step closer, my eyes locking with hers, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I watched the color drain from her face, as I watched the small, tight flicker of fear slip into her eyes. The late-night messages. The private meetings. The whispered promises. "I know what you've been doing." She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, to deflect, to twist my words into something smaller, something less dangerous, something she could control. But the words never came. She just stood there, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths, her eyes wide, her lips parted in a small, silent gasp, the soft, steady pulse of fear blooming in the space between us like a dark, spreading stain. And in that moment, I felt the first real flicker of power bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. I had her. And now, all I had to do was decide what to do next. The panic hit her all at once. I could see it in the way her breath caught in her throat, in the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, in the way her eyes flicked to the side, searching for an exit, for an escape, for a way out of the corner she had backed herself into. She took a shaky step back, her heels clicking softly against the wooden planks of the deck, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths, her eyes wide, her lips parted in a small, silent gasp. "Sophie," I said, my voice low, my tone steady, the quiet, deliberate calm of a man who has already made up his mind, who has already committed himself to the confrontation he has been building toward for weeks. "Don't bother denying it. I've seen the messages. I know what you've been doing." She shook her head, her hair spilling over her shoulders in a dark, tangled wave, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing into a thin, tight line as she forced herself to meet my gaze, as she tried to summon the same, polished confidence she had once used to disarm me, to lull me into a false sense of security, to convince me that she was nothing more than the perfect, devoted wife Caleb had convinced himself she was. "You don't know anything," she whispered, her voice sharp, her tone tight, the small, breathless hiss of a woman who has been caught, who has been cornered, who has been found out. "You're just trying to stir up trouble. You're just looking for an excuse to drive a wedge between me and Caleb. You're just..." "Save it," I cut in, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, my eyes locking with hers, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I took a small, deliberate step closer, closing the distance between us, pushing her further into the corner she had tried so desperately to avoid. "I'm not the one you need to worry about. I'm not the one whose life is about to fall apart. I'm not the one who built my marriage on a foundation of lies." She flinched, her eyes flicking away, her jaw clenching, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as she struggled to regain her composure, as she fought to keep her polished, perfect mask from slipping, as she tried to piece together the shattered fragments of the life she had so carefully constructed around herself and Caleb. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice tight, her tone sharp, the small, breathless plea of a woman who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of her carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what this would do to him. To our family. To Mia." And for a moment, I felt a small, sharp flicker of something like sympathy bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of doubt that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. But then I remembered Caleb's threat, the tight, clipped tone of his voice, the sharp, dark flicker of contempt in his eyes, the small, whispered promise he had made to destroy me if I ever hurt his sister. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. It didn't take long for Caleb to sense that something was off. Men like him always do. The ones who pride themselves on control, who measure their worth in the loyalty of those around them, who build their lives on a foundation of fear and quiet, unspoken dominance. He cornered me at Mia's birthday party, the kind of loud, chaotic gathering that felt like a reminder of why I had fallen in love with her in the first place, the warmth of her laughter, the brightness of her smile, the easy, unguarded way she moved through the world when surrounded by the people she loved. I had been standing near the bar, nursing a whiskey, my eyes tracking Mia as she moved through the crowd, her head tipped back in laughter, her dark hair catching the warm glow of the overhead lights, her dress swaying softly against her legs as she leaned into the small, tight-knit group of friends gathered near the fire pit. Caleb slipped up beside me, his broad shoulders blocking out the light, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp, the small, dark flicker of something dangerous slipping into his expression as he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, his voice low, his tone steady. "You and I need to talk," he said, his grip tightening on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my flesh like a vice, his eyes locking with mine, the small, sharp flicker of something dangerous slipping into his expression as he took a small, deliberate step back, his jaw clenching, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to read the tight set of his jaw, the small, dark flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, the small, sharp flicker of a man who has already made up his mind, who has already committed himself to the confrontation he has been building toward for weeks. "Outside," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, his eyes flicking to the side, his jaw clenching, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths as he turned on his heel, his shoulders stiff, his posture tense as he slipped through the crowd, his shadow stretching long across the polished marble floor. I hesitated, my mind racing, my pulse quickening, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to decide what to do, what this meant, what the small, whispered fragment of a confrontation might reveal. But then I saw Mia, her head tipped back in laughter, her dark hair catching the warm glow of the overhead lights, her smile wide, her eyes bright, her voice slipping through the crowded room like a whispered secret, and I felt the first, sharp sting of fear creep into my chest, the slow, creeping certainty that whatever happened next would change everything. So I followed him, because what choice did I have? Caleb led me out onto the back patio, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind us, the warm, muffled hum of the party slipping away as the cool night air wrapped around us, the distant, echoing thump of music and laughter fading into the quiet, steady pulse of my own heartbeat. He didn't waste time. Didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk or the thin, polished veneer of civility he had once used to mask his true intentions. He just turned, his broad shoulders blocking out the light spilling through the windows, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp, the small, dark flicker of something dangerous slipping into his expression as he took a small, deliberate step closer. "I'm only going to say this once," he said, his voice low, his tone steady, the quiet, deliberate calm of a man who has already made up his mind, who has already committed himself to the confrontation he has been building toward for weeks. "So I suggest you listen." I felt my pulse quicken, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to read the tight set of his jaw, the small, dark flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, the small, sharp flicker of a man who has already decided to destroy me. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, his eyes locking with mine, his jaw clenching, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths as he took another small, deliberate step closer, his breath warm against my face, his words slipping from his lips like a slow, steady drip of poison. "But I'm telling you right now, you're making a mistake." I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides, my nails biting into my palms, the cool, damp air clinging to my skin as I forced myself to meet his gaze, to hold my ground, to refuse to flinch beneath the weight of his scrutiny. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenching, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths as he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. "I know you've been talking to Sophie. I know you've been asking questions. I know you've been trying to dig up dirt on me. And I'm telling you right now, you're going to regret it." I felt my jaw clench, my teeth grinding together as his words settled into the space between us, as the full weight of his threat crashed down around me like a wave, cold and sharp and impossible to ignore. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, his eyes locking with mine, his jaw clenching, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. "You don't know what I'm capable of. You don't know what I'm willing to do to protect my family. So I'm going to give you one chance to walk away. One chance to forget whatever it is you think you know. One chance to leave my family alone. Or I will make you regret it." And as he straightened, as he took a small, deliberate step back, as he turned to leave without another word, I felt the slow, creeping burn of anger twist into something colder, something sharper, something that felt a lot like resolve. He had threatened me. Again. Made me feel small. Made me feel weak. Made me feel like a man with something to hide. But what Caleb didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that I had my own secrets. My own leverage. My own truths to threaten. And when the time came, I would make sure he understood exactly who he was dealing with. I didn't act right away. Not because I was afraid. But because I wanted to be sure. Because I wanted to be thorough. Because I wanted to be certain that when I finally made my move, when I finally turned the tables on Caleb, there would be no way for him to squirm out of it. No way for him to twist my words into something smaller. Something less dangerous. Something he could control. So I bided my time. Waited for the right moment. Kept my head down. Played the part of the quiet, dutiful boyfriend. The supportive, loving partner Mia had always believed me to be. The man Caleb had so clearly underestimated. But behind the scenes, I was already laying the groundwork for my first real strike. Quiet, Subtle moves that felt like whispered secrets slipping through the cracks in Caleb's carefully curated life. Small, deliberate steps that felt like whispered confessions slipping through the thin, polished veneer of his perfect, polished facade. I started with his business. The one he had poured his heart into. The one he had built from the ground up. The one he had always talked about with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had never known failure. I made a few quiet inquiries. Reached out to a few mutual contacts. Asked a few pointed questions. Dropped a few carefully chosen hints. Pushed a few small, delicate buttons. Watched as the first, small cracks began to form in the foundation of the empire Caleb had built on a foundation of whispered lies and broken promises. I found out that his business was struggling. That his finances were stretched thin. That his investors were growing impatient. That his partners were beginning to lose faith. That his carefully constructed world was already starting to crumble beneath the weight of his own arrogance. And then I found the real prize. The small, whispered secret he had tried so desperately to hide, the one loose thread that had the potential to unravel everything he had built, the one small, whispered confession that felt like a blade slipping between his ribs. It was a simple thing, really. A single line in a quarterly earnings report, a small, overlooked detail buried in the fine print, a quiet, unspoken truth that felt like a whispered confession slipping through the cracks in Caleb's carefully curated life. But it was enough. Enough to ruin him. Enough to destroy everything he had worked for. Enough to bring his carefully constructed world crashing down around him in a shower of shattered glass and whispered lies. And as I sat there, my laptop open in front of me, the cool, steady glow of the screen slipping over my fingers like a whispered promise, I felt the first real flicker of power bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. I had made my first move. And now, all I had to do was wait for Caleb to realize the game had changed. The first sign that my move had hit its mark came a week later. It was a Thursday afternoon. The kind of slow, quiet day that slips past without notice. When the world feels too still. Too heavy. Too quiet. I had just stepped out of a meeting. My phone buzzing in my pocket. The small, sharp vibration cutting through the muffled, echoing hum of office chatter. The soft, steady pulse of fluorescent lights humming above my head. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My eyes flicking to the screen. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I read the name glowing against the cool, glass surface. Caleb. I hesitated. My thumb hovering over the screen. My mind racing. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to decide what to do. What this meant. What the small, whispered fragment of a confrontation might reveal. I swiped the screen. Lifted the phone to my ear. My voice slipping out in a slow, steady whisper. The quiet, deliberate calm of a man who has already made up his mind. Who has already committed himself to the confrontation he has been building toward for weeks. Caleb, I said. My voice low. My tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something dangerous slipping into my expression as I leaned back against the cool, polished surface of the hallway wall. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I waited for his response. There was a long, heavy pause. The soft, muffled crackle of static slipping through the line. The small, whispered hint of Caleb's ragged, uneven breathing slipping through the thin, polished veneer of his carefully controlled facade. I don't know what you think you're doing, he said finally, his voice low, his tone sharp, the small, breathless hiss of a man who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. But I'm telling you right now, you're making a mistake. I felt my jaw clench, my teeth grinding together as his words settled into the space between us, as the full weight of his threat crashed down around me like a wave, cold and sharp and impossible to ignore. You don't know what you're dealing with, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, his words slipping from his lips like a slow, steady drip of poison. You don't know what I'm capable of. You don't know what I'm willing to do to protect my family. So I'm going to give you one chance to walk away. One chance to forget whatever it is you think you know. One chance to leave my family alone. Or I will make you regret it. I felt the slow, creeping burn of anger twist into something colder, something sharper, something that felt a lot like resolve. He had made his move. And now, it was my turn. I didn't waste time. Not after that call. Not after the thin, veiled threat that had slipped from Caleb's lips like a slow, steady drip of poison. The small, whispered promise of violence that had felt like a blade slipping between my ribs. I had already laid the groundwork. Had already set the pieces in motion. Had already pulled on the loose threads of Caleb's carefully constructed life. The small, whispered secrets he had tried so desperately to hide. The small, overlooked details he had convinced himself were safe. Secure. Unbreakable. But I wanted to be thorough. I wanted to be certain. I wanted to make sure that when I finally made my move, when I finally turned the tables on Caleb, there would be no way for him to squirm out of it. No way for him to twist my words into something smaller. Something less dangerous. Something he could control. So, I reached out to a few mutual contacts. Dropped a few carefully chosen hints. Pushed a few small, delicate buttons. Watched as the first, small cracks began to form in the foundation of the empire Caleb had built on a foundation of whispered lies and broken promises. I found out that his business was more than just struggling. It was on the verge of collapse. That his investors were pulling out. That his finances were stretched thin. That his partners were growing impatient. That his carefully constructed world was already starting to crumble beneath the weight of his own arrogance. And then I found the real prize. The one loose thread that had the potential to unravel everything he had built, the one small, whispered confession that felt like a blade slipping between his ribs. A single, overlooked email. A small, quiet message tucked into the corner of a long, winding chain of correspondence between Caleb and his investors, the small, whispered hint of a deal gone wrong, the quiet, unspoken truth of a man who had overpromised, who had overextended himself, who had bet everything on a single, desperate gamble. I compiled the evidence, saved the files, organized the emails, pieced together the small, whispered fragments of his downfall, the slow, steady drip of his lies slipping through the cracks in his carefully curated life. And then, when I was certain, when I was ready, when I had crossed every T and dotted every I, I sent the files to his investors, to his partners, to his clients, to everyone who had ever placed their trust in him, to everyone who had ever believed in the illusion he had so carefully constructed around himself. I hit send, watched the small, green progress bar slip across the screen, felt the slow, steady pulse of power bloom in my chest, the small, whispered flicker of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. And then I sat back, my fingers curled loosely around the edge of my desk, my heart steady in my chest, my pulse calm, my mind clear, and waited for the fallout. It didn't take long. A day. Maybe two. And then the calls started. The emails. The frantic, breathless messages slipping through the thin, polished veneer of Caleb's carefully controlled facade, the small, whispered hints of a man who had finally realized the truth, who had finally felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. And as I sat there, my phone buzzing on the desk beside me, my laptop humming softly in the background, the cool, steady glow of the screen slipping over my fingers like a whispered promise, I felt the first real flicker of satisfaction bloom in my chest, the slow, steady pulse of strength that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. I had made my move. And this time, there would be no going back. Checkmate. My father, he told me I wasn't man enough. Said I'd never make it. Said I didn't have what it takes to build anything without him. And yet there he was, standing in front of the house he always wanted. Staring at the wraparound porch like it was the altar of a church he'd never been worthy of. He didn't know yet. Didn't know it was mine. Didn't know I'd bought it. With my own money. With the hands he said would never build anything that mattered. The old Chevy my father refused to give up rattled up the driveway, tires crunching against gravel he once called too high maintenance. He stepped out slower than I remembered, stiffer, older, a little more tired behind the eyes. But the look on his face when he saw the house? It was like watching a man realize he was too late to reclaim the throne he abandoned. And all I could think about was the day he said it. It had been a Saturday, gray light filtering through the cracked window of our garage. The air was thick with the scent of rust, motor oil, and unspoken resentment. He stood next to his workbench, turning a rusted wrench over in his hand like it was a gavel. Like he was the judge and I was already guilty. "You're not man enough," he said, quiet, cold, final. The words landed harder than any punch. Not man enough to lead a family. Not man enough to stand on your own. Not man enough to take care of yourself without someone cleaning up your mess. I don't even remember what I said in response. I just remember the sound of my own heartbeat. And the silence after. That moment didn't break me. Not really. It carved a hollow space inside me where something new would eventually grow. It planted the idea that I didn't need his approval. Didn't need his backup. Didn't need him at all. But it took years to turn that idea into truth. And now? Now I was standing on the porch of the house he had dreamed about for decades. The one with the bay windows, the wide front lawn, and the 3-car garage. The house he said he'd buy when the time was right. The one that became his favorite excuse. The crown jewel of the fantasy he never earned. And now it was mine. No cosigner. No handout. No help. Just me. And the long, crooked path I walked to get here. He hadn't seen me yet. I waited. Watched him walk toward the steps. Watched him glance up at the porch like he didn't believe it was real. And then, slowly, I stepped into view, one hand resting on the smooth banister he used to talk about like it was gold-plated. He froze. I didn't smile. Didn't nod. Didn't say a word. Because this moment wasn't about greeting him. It was about letting him see what I'd become without him. The man he said I'd never be. The thing about a father's words is that they have a way of sticking with you. Of slipping into the quiet, hidden corners of your mind. Of wrapping themselves around your better judgment like a slowly tightening noose. Of echoing through the empty, aching spaces of your heart long after the sound of his voice has faded into the distance. I had always struggled to live up to my father's expectations. Had always felt the small, sharp sting of his disappointment slip through the cracks in my carefully constructed confidence. Had always heard the quiet, whispered reminders of my shortcomings slip through the thin, polished veneer of my self-assurance. It had been that way for as long as I could remember. From the first time I dropped a pass in Little League. To the first time I brought home a less than stellar report card. To the first time I hesitated before throwing a punch in the 7th grade locker room. To the first time I choked on the words I had meant to say to the pretty girl with the bright blue eyes and the slow, easy smile in my freshman English class. I had always felt like I was coming up short. Like I was falling just a little too far behind. Like I was running just a little too slowly. Like I was never quite good enough. Never quite strong enough. Never quite man enough for the father who had raised me. I tried to shake it off. Tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. That I was letting my own insecurities twist his words into something darker. Something more dangerous. Something that felt a lot like a warning. But the truth was, his words had cut deeper than I had realized. Had slipped into the small, hidden corners of my mind like a blade. Had twisted themselves into the small, whispered fragments of my self-worth like a slow, steady drip of poison. I found myself replaying his words in my mind. Turning them over like a small, jagged stone. Running my fingers over the sharp, uneven edges. Trying to piece together the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence. Trying to convince myself that I was more than the sum of my mistakes. That I was more than the small, whispered fragments of a boy who had never quite lived up to his father's expectations. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken self-worth slipped through my fingers, I felt the first, sharp sting of something darker. Something colder. Something that felt a lot like resentment. Because the truth was, I was tired of feeling small. Tired of feeling weak. Tired of feeling like a man who had something to prove. And I was ready to change that. Ready to prove my father wrong. Ready to take back my life. Ready to become the man I had always known I could be. Deciding to prove my father wrong wasn't a single, defining moment. It was a slow, steady process. A quiet, simmering resolve that felt like a small, whispered promise slipping through the cracks in my carefully constructed confidence. A slow, steady pulse of determination that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. It started with the small things. I moved out of my parents' house. Found a small, cramped apartment on the edge of town. Signed the lease with the small, tight flicker of something like defiance slipping into my expression as I handed over the first month's rent. As I slipped my key into the rusty, creaking lock of my new front door. As I took my first, small, unsteady steps toward independence. The apartment was nothing special. Just a small, one-bedroom unit with chipped linoleum floors. Flickering overhead lights. And a kitchen sink that leaked every time I turned the faucet too far to the left. The walls were thin. The neighbors loud. The hallways narrow and dimly lit. The faint, metallic scent of old cigarettes and stale beer clinging to the air like a whispered secret. But it was mine. It was a place I could call my own. A small, whispered fragment of a life I had built for myself. A small, shining symbol of my first, tentative steps toward independence. I got a job. Nothing glamorous. Just a part-time gig at a local hardware store. Stacking boxes. Sweeping floors. Ringing up customers with the small, tight flicker of something like pride slipping into my expression as I handed over their change. As I bagged their purchases. As I watched the small, shining coin slip through their fingers like a slow, steady pulse of freedom. I started saving my paychecks. Tucking the small, crumpled bills into an old, metal lockbox I kept beneath my bed. Watching the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom pile up in slow, steady increments. Feeling the first, sharp sting of something like hope bloom in my chest every time I counted the small, jagged pieces of my future slipping through my fingers. I even started working out. Pushing my body to its limits. Feeling the slow, steady burn of my muscles stretching and tearing and rebuilding themselves beneath the cool, polished surface of the weight bench. The small, whispered fragments of my physical strength slipping into place like the slow, steady pulse of a heartbeat beneath my skin. And slowly, day by day, inch by inch, I felt myself growing stronger. More confident. More capable. More man enough than I had ever felt in my life. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like self-respect. It didn't happen overnight. The slow, steady process of finding my path, of building a life for myself, of proving my father wrong, of becoming the man I had always known I could be. It started with a job. A real job. Not just the part-time gig at the hardware store, not just the small, menial tasks I had once used to scrape together a few extra dollars at the end of each month, not just the slow, steady grind of minimum wage and overworked muscles and late-night shifts. I landed a position as a junior project manager at a small construction firm, a family-owned business with a tight-knit crew of hard-working men who had never been afraid to get their hands dirty, who had never shied away from the long, punishing hours and the back-breaking labor that came with building something from the ground up. I started at the bottom, sweeping floors, hauling lumber, stacking bricks in the sweltering heat of the summer sun, my muscles straining, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as I pushed my body to its limits, as I forced myself to keep going, to keep moving, to keep building the small, whispered fragments of my future one brick at a time. But slowly, day by day, inch by inch, I worked my way up. Earned the respect of the men I worked with, proved my worth through the quiet, steady pulse of my hard work and determination, earned a promotion to crew lead, then site supervisor, then assistant project manager. I learned the ins and outs of the business, studied the blueprints, pored over the project plans, ran the numbers, negotiated with vendors, balanced the budgets, took on more responsibility, made more decisions, claimed my place at the table without a second thought. I even started my own side hustle, flipping small, run-down properties on the weekends, turning crumbling, forgotten buildings into small, shining symbols of my growing success, tucking the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom into my savings account, watching the small, jagged pieces of my future pile up in slow, steady increments, feeling the first, sharp sting of something like hope bloom in my chest every time I checked my account balance. And slowly, day by day, inch by inch, I felt myself growing stronger. More confident. More capable. More man enough than I had ever felt in my life. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like pride. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of gray, overcast day that clings to your skin. That seeps into your bones. That makes the world feel small and sharp and unforgiving. I had been sitting in my small, cramped office at the construction firm. My laptop open in front of me. The soft, steady hum of the overhead lights slipping through the thin, polished air. The small, sharp flicker of something like pride blooming in my chest as I scrolled through the latest financial reports. As I watched the small, whispered fragments of my growing success slip into focus on the cool, glass surface of my screen. I had come a long way. Had built a small, profitable side hustle for myself. Had flipped a handful of rundown properties into small, shining symbols of my financial freedom. Had saved enough money to consider making a real, serious investment in my future. But then, with a single email, it all came crashing down. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My pulse quicken. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I read the small, black words slipping across the cool, glowing screen. As the full, crushing weight of the setback crashed down around me like a wave. Cold and sharp and impossible to ignore. The bank had rejected my latest loan application. Had reviewed my financials. Had weighed my credit score. Had considered my small, but steady stream of side income. And had decided that I was too much of a risk. That I was too young. Too inexperienced. Too unproven to warrant the kind of financial support I needed to take my business to the next level. I felt my jaw clench. My teeth grinding together as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped through my fingers. As the small, jagged pieces of my carefully constructed self-worth shattered around me like broken glass. As the small, sharp flicker of self-doubt crept into the dark, hidden corners of my mind. For a moment, I felt the slow, creeping burn of anger twist into something colder. Something sharper. Something that felt a lot like fear. Had I come this far just to fail? Had I worked this hard just to fall short? Had I sacrificed so much just to be told that I wasn't man enough to make it on my own? I took a deep breath. My hands curling into fists beneath the cool, polished surface of my desk. My mind racing. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I tried to push the small, whispered fragments of my self-doubt back into the dark, hidden corners of my mind. No. I wouldn't give up. I wouldn't back down. I wouldn't let a single, whispered setback derail the slow, steady progress I had made, the small, whispered fragments of my growing success slipping through my fingers like a slow, steady pulse of freedom. I would find another way. I would push through the pain. I would prove my father wrong. I would prove myself right. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like resolve. The thing about setbacks is that they have a way of sharpening your focus, of forcing you to double down, to dig deep, to push yourself beyond the limits you once believed unbreakable, to find the small, hidden reservoirs of strength you never knew you had. After the bank rejected my loan application, after the small, whispered fragments of my carefully constructed self-worth shattered around me like broken glass, after the slow, creeping burn of anger twisted into something colder, something sharper, something that felt a lot like resolve, I decided to change my approach. If the bank wouldn't back me, I'd find someone who would. I started reaching out to private investors, spent long, sleepless nights drafting business proposals, polishing my financial projections, perfecting my pitch, pushing myself to the limits of my patience and perseverance as I reached out to everyone I had ever met, as I scoured the dark, hidden corners of the internet for potential backers, as I cold called dozens of small, independent lenders, as I pushed through the small, whispered fragments of my fear and self-doubt like a man on a mission. And slowly, day by day, inch by inch, the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom slipped back into place. I landed my first small, private loan. A modest sum, just enough to cover the down payment on my next property, just enough to get my foot in the door, just enough to prove to myself that I was still capable of moving forward, that I was still capable of building a future for myself, that I was still capable of becoming the man I had always known I could be. I flipped the property within 6 months, turned a small, but respectable profit, pocketed the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom like a slow, steady pulse of hope, like the quiet, steady hum of a heartbeat beneath my skin. I paid off the private loan, rolled the profits into my next project, found another investor, another property, another small, whispered opportunity to prove myself, to build something from the ground up, to push myself beyond the limits of my own self-doubt and whispered fears. And slowly, day by day, inch by inch, the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, the small, jagged pieces of my shattered self-worth slowly, steadily forming something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like self-respect. I was still a long way from the life I had imagined for myself, still a long way from proving my father wrong, still a long way from becoming the man I had always known I could be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path, like I was moving in the right direction, like I was finally becoming the man I had always known I could be. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like pride. It was a chance conversation. The kind of small, unremarkable moment that feels like nothing at the time. That slips past unnoticed. That drifts into the quiet, forgotten corners of your mind like a whispered secret. That only reveals its true significance in hindsight. I had been sitting in my small, cluttered office. My laptop open in front of me. The soft, steady hum of the overhead lights slipping through the thin, polished air. The small, whispered fragments of my growing success slipping into focus on the cool, glass surface of my screen. My phone buzzed. The small, sharp vibration slipping through the quiet, polished air like a whispered reminder of the world outside my four walls. The small, tight flicker of something like hope blooming in my chest as I reached for the cool, glass surface of my phone. As I swiped the screen. As I lifted the device to my ear. My voice slipping out in a slow, steady whisper. "Hey, Mom," I said. My voice low. My tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something like pride slipping into my expression as I leaned back in my chair. My pulse quickening. My heart thudding steadily in my chest as I listened to the small, breathless hum of my mother's voice slipping through the line. We talked for a while. About the weather. About her garden. About my younger brother's baseball team. About the small, whispered fragments of our lives slipping through the thin, polished air of the phone line like a slow, steady pulse of normalcy. And then, somewhere in the middle of a long, winding tangent about the new family that had moved in down the street. My mother let something slip. They bought the old Waverly House, she said. Her voice low. Her tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something like nostalgia slipping into her expression as she sighed. As she took a small, deliberate breath. As she let the small, whispered fragments of her memories slip through the cracks in her carefully constructed composure. You know, the one your dad always wanted. The one with the wraparound porch and the big, open lot and the 3-car garage. The one he used to talk about all the time when you were a kid. The one he always said he'd buy if he ever got the chance. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My pulse quicken. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as the full, crushing weight of her words crashed down around me like a wave. Cold and sharp and impossible to ignore. The Waverly House. The house my father had always dreamed of owning. The house he had once promised to buy for his family. The house he had once used as a symbol of his own manhood. His own strength. His own success. And in that moment, as the small, whispered fragments of my mother's words slipped through the thin, polished air, as the small, jagged pieces of my father's broken promises slipped into place in the dark, hidden corners of my mind, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like ambition. The idea of buying the Waverly House lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, sharp and stubborn, refusing to be ignored, refusing to be forgotten, refusing to be dismissed as a foolish, impossible dream. It became my obsession. My focus. My purpose. I doubled down on my work, pushed myself harder, drove myself further, poured every ounce of my time, energy, and money into my growing portfolio, the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom slipping into place like the slow, steady pulse of a heartbeat beneath my skin. I flipped 3 more properties in the span of a year, each project bigger, riskier, more ambitious than the last. I leveraged my growing reputation, tapped into my expanding network of private investors, negotiated better deals, cut tighter contracts, pushed for higher returns, took calculated risks that felt like whispered promises slipping through the cracks in my carefully constructed confidence. I stopped going out, stopped taking vacations, stopped spending money on anything that wasn't directly related to my business, lived on cheap, instant ramen and day-old bagels, spent my weekends hauling lumber and pouring concrete and hanging drywall, the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom slipping through my fingers like a slow, steady pulse of progress. I even sold my car, the old, beat-up Chevy my father had handed down to me when I turned 16, the small, rusted symbol of my independence, the small, whispered reminder of a boy who had never quite lived up to his father's expectations. I replaced it with a battered, second-hand pickup, the kind of rusted, dented, gas-guzzling beast that felt more at home on a construction site than a suburban driveway, the kind of rough, unpolished vehicle that felt like a small, whispered promise of the man I was becoming, the small, jagged pieces of my broken confidence slipping back into place with every slow, steady turn of the ignition. And slowly, day by day, inch by inch, I felt myself growing stronger. More confident. More capable. More man enough than I had ever felt in my life. I watched my bank account grow, watched the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom pile up in slow, steady increments, felt the first, sharp sting of something like pride bloom in my chest every time I checked my account balance, every time I watched the small, jagged pieces of my shattered self-worth slip back into place, every time I caught my own reflection in the cracked, dirt-streaked side mirror of my battered pickup truck. And as the days stretched into weeks, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like power. It took me almost 2 years to save enough for the down payment. 2 years of long nights. Early mornings. Missed weekends. Cancelled plans. Late night takeout. And cold, quiet mornings spent alone in the cramped, cluttered corners of my small, one-bedroom apartment. But I did it. I scraped together every spare dollar. Every small, whispered fragment of my financial freedom. Every small, jagged piece of my broken self-worth. Every small, whispered reminder of the man I had become. The man I had fought so hard to become. The man I had always known I could be. And then, on a quiet, gray morning in early spring, I made my move. I scheduled a meeting with the listing agent. Slipped into my best suit. Polished my shoes. Straightened my tie. Shaved the rough, 3-day stubble from my jaw. Ran my fingers through my hair. Took a deep, steadying breath. And walked into the small, sunlit real estate office with the slow, steady pulse of a man who had already made up his mind. Who had already committed himself to the confrontation he had been building toward for years. I shook the agent's hand. Forced a small, tight smile. Took a seat in the stiff, overstuffed leather chair across from his desk. Watched the small, tight flicker of surprise slip into his eyes as I introduced myself. As I leaned in. As I made my offer. As I watched the small, whispered fragments of my financial freedom slip into focus in the cool, polished air of his office. He hesitated. His eyes narrowing. His jaw clenching. The small, sharp flicker of something like doubt slipping into his expression as he glanced down at the small, crumpled stack of documents in his hand. As he flipped through the small, jagged pieces of my financial history. As he tried to piece together the small, whispered fragments of my life from the small, typed lines of my credit report. I felt my pulse quicken. My heart thudding painfully against my ribs as I forced myself to hold his gaze. To stand my ground. To refuse to flinch beneath the weight of his scrutiny. And then, finally, mercifully, he leaned back, his shoulders relaxing, his jaw unclenching, his lips curling into a small, tight smile as he extended his hand, as he nodded, as he whispered the small, breathless words I had been waiting to hear for years. "Congratulations," he said, his voice low, his tone steady, the small, tight flicker of something like respect slipping into his expression as he met my eyes, as he shook my hand, as he sealed the deal with the small, whispered promise of a new beginning. "You just bought yourself a house." And in that moment, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, as the small, jagged pieces of my shattered self-worth formed something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like power, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like victory. I didn't rush it. I took my time. Let the ink dry on the closing documents, let the small, whispered fragments of my new life slip into place, let the small, jagged pieces of my financial freedom settle into the cool, polished corners of my mind. I spent the first few days walking through the empty halls of my new home, my footsteps echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings, my breath slipping through the cool, polished air like a whispered promise, my pulse steady, my heart calm, my mind clear. I ran my fingers over the smooth, polished banister of the grand staircase, traced the intricate, hand-carved details of the wooden molding, pressed my palm against the cool, glass surface of the oversized windows that looked out over the sprawling, manicured lawn, watched the small, whispered fragments of my reflection slip into focus in the thin, polished panes of glass. I even stood on the wide, wraparound porch, the one my father had always dreamed of, the one he had always promised to buy for his family, the one he had once used as a symbol of his own manhood, his own strength, his own success. And slowly, day by day, inch by inch, the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, the small, jagged pieces of my shattered self-worth forming something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like power. When I finally felt ready, when I finally felt strong enough, confident enough, man enough to face my father, I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, found his name, took a deep, steadying breath, and hit the small, green call button. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. The small, tight flicker of something like fear blooming in my chest as I waited for him to answer. As I waited for the small, whispered fragments of my past to slip back into focus. As I waited for the small, jagged pieces of my broken heart to settle into place. "Hello?" he said. His voice low. His tone sharp. The small, tight flicker of something like surprise slipping into his expression as he realized who was on the other end of the line. As he tried to piece together the small, whispered fragments of our strained relationship. "Hey, Dad," I said. My voice low. My tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something like defiance slipping into my expression as I leaned back against the cool, polished surface of the kitchen island. My pulse steady. My heart calm. My mind clear. "I've got something I want to show you. Something I think you're going to like." He hesitated. His breath catching in his throat. His jaw clenching. The small, sharp flicker of something like doubt slipping into his expression as he tried to read the tight set of my jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like determination in my eyes. But then, finally, mercifully, he agreed. His voice low. His tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something like curiosity slipping into his expression as he whispered the small, breathless words I had been waiting to hear for years. "All right," he said. His voice tight. His tone sharp. The small, breathless hiss of a man who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "Show me what you've got." And in that moment, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new. Something sharp. Something dangerous. Something that felt a lot like satisfaction. The day my father pulled up to the Waverly house. I felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't known I was capable of. A quiet, steady pulse of confidence that felt like a heartbeat beneath my skin. A slow, steady hum of power that felt like the low, thrumming vibration of a well-tuned engine. I watched from the wide, wrap-around porch as his old, beat-up Chevy rattled up the long, winding driveway. The small, rusted symbol of his stubborn, unbreakable pride slipping through the cool, polished air of my perfectly manicured front lawn. The soft, steady hum of his engine slipping through the thin, polished air like a whispered promise. He parked in front of the house, his tires crunching against the smooth, white gravel of the driveway, his engine sputtering to a halt, the small, sharp flicker of something like doubt slipping into his expression as he stepped out of the truck, as he slammed the door shut behind him, as he straightened, as he ran his eyes over the towering, brick facade of the Waverly house, the small, tight flicker of something like disbelief slipping into his expression as he took a small, hesitant step forward. For a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, the cool, polished air slipping around us like a whispered secret, the slow, steady pulse of the past slipping through the cracks in the present, the small, jagged pieces of our strained relationship slipping into focus in the thin, polished air of my front yard. Finally, mercifully, he broke the silence, his voice low, his tone sharp, the small, breathless hiss of a man who has already realized the truth, who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "Whose place is this?" he said, his voice tight, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing as he took another small, hesitant step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, his breath coming in slow, shallow gasps as he tried to piece together the small, whispered fragments of my life, as he tried to read the tight set of my jaw, the small, dark flicker of something like defiance in my eyes. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart thudding steadily in my chest as I took a small, deliberate step forward, as I leaned against the cool, polished surface of the porch railing, as I forced myself to hold his gaze, to stand my ground, to refuse to flinch beneath the weight of his scrutiny. "It's mine," I said, my voice low, my tone steady, the small, tight flicker of something like pride slipping into my expression as I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to read the tight set of his jaw, the small, dark flicker of something like disbelief in his eyes. "I bought it. Paid for it with my own money. Earned every square inch of it. And I did it without you." He flinched, his eyes flicking to the side, his jaw clenching, his chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths as he forced himself to meet my gaze, as he tried to summon the same, polished confidence he had once used to disarm me, to lull me into a false sense of security, to convince me that I was still the scared, uncertain boy he had once known. But the truth was, I wasn't that boy anymore. I was a man. A self-made man. A man who had built his own life, his own success, his own future, without his father's help, without his father's approval, without his father's whispered promises of manhood and strength and success. And as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, as the small, jagged pieces of my shattered self-worth formed something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like power, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like victory. The moment my father stepped onto the porch. His boots clapping against the polished wooden planks. The small, tight flicker of something like disbelief slipping into his expression as he ran his fingers over the smooth, polished railing. As he traced the intricate, hand-carved details of the wooden banister. As he took in the towering, brick facade of the house he had once dreamed of owning. I felt the first, sharp sting of something like peace bloom in my chest. We stood there for a moment. The cool, polished air slipping around us like a whispered secret. The slow, steady pulse of the past slipping through the cracks in the present. The small, jagged pieces of our strained relationship slipping into focus in the thin, polished air of my front porch. Finally, mercifully, he broke the silence. His voice low. His tone sharp. The small, breathless hiss of a man who has already realized the truth. Who has already felt the first, sharp sting of his carefully constructed world coming apart at the seams. "This is yours?" he said. His voice tight. His jaw clenching. His eyes narrowing as he took another small, hesitant step forward. His boots clapping against the polished wooden planks. His breath coming in slow, shallow gasps as he tried to piece together the small, whispered fragments of my life. As he tried to read the tight set of my jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like defiance in my eyes. I felt my pulse quicken. My heart thudding steadily in my chest as I took a small, deliberate step forward. As I leaned against the cool, polished surface of the porch railing. As I forced myself to hold his gaze. To stand my ground. To refuse to flinch beneath the weight of his scrutiny. "It's mine," I said. My voice low. My tone steady. The small, tight flicker of something like pride slipping into my expression as I leaned in. My breath catching in my throat as I tried to read the tight set of his jaw. The small, dark flicker of something like disbelief in his eyes. I bought it. Paid for it with my own money. Earned every square inch of it. And I did it without you. For a moment. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, the cool, polished air slipping around us like a whispered secret, the slow, steady pulse of the past slipping through the cracks in the present, the small, jagged pieces of our strained relationship slipping into focus in the thin, polished air of my front porch. And then, finally, mercifully, he let out a slow, steady breath, his shoulders relaxing, his jaw unclenching, his eyes softening as he reached out, his fingers tightening around the smooth, polished surface of the porch railing, his voice slipping out in a slow, steady whisper. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice low, his tone steady, the small, tight flicker of something like regret slipping into his expression as he met my eyes, as he held my gaze, as he forced himself to acknowledge the man I had become, the man I had always known I could be, the man I had fought so hard to become without his help, without his approval, without his whispered promises of manhood and strength and success. And in that moment, as the small, whispered fragments of my broken confidence slipped back into place, as the small, jagged pieces of my shattered self-worth formed something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like peace, I felt the first, sharp sting of something new, something sharp, something dangerous, something that felt a lot like self-respect.
Silence isn't weakness, it's precision. And when the dust settled, the ones who made the most noise, they disappeared first. For more quiet power and louder downfalls, Hit subscribe and watch them unravel.